Hey everyone, welcome to the Darshan Talks podcast. I have three super special guests. This is what I refer to as the dream team. And we've got some really fun conversations planned around centralized monitoring, decentralized trials, and remote studies. So let's see what that means. Is there a difference between the three?
This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
Artem, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. My name is Artem Andrianov. I'm a CEO and one of the co-founders of Syntegrity. Syntegrity is RBQM software provider or a solution enabler. And since already 8 years, I'm afraid, we've been providing these services for big and small pharma companies, enabling these centralized monitoring, obviously, for them, and adaptive monitoring for them, but now which grows into some more exciting areas like clinical trial risk management or risk-based quality management, which are huge topics. That's it from my side.
Well, Artem, before we jump to the next person, quick question for you. You said you started this 8 years ago. 8 years ago, this concept of centralized monitoring, I think the guidances were just coming out. The concept was so new. You've obviously been viable for eight years, enough for you to sort of have come to this point. How was the initial industry uptake on risk-based monitoring and centralized monitoring at that time? And how has that changed?
So 8 years, there were nobody who was speaking about risk-based monitoring, at least when we started. We started that because we saw the potential. So I myself and my team, we were analyzing clinical trials all the days. We were part of ERT, part of large EDC provider, obviously. And we saw that there is so much potential to identify operational risks, identify dirty data, identify some information which helps to do the studies much more better than they are happening or were happening before. That's why we started an independent data quality bureau. So, and that's what you can read in our name. So Syntegrity, clinical integrity. So that's what we're thinking, okay, what pharma company needs that days? So we were not even considering that such a push from regulatory, from FDA, EMA, ICH altogether. We're driving this, creating new art of business, so to say, new blue ocean, as business people say. So we were not even anticipating that, but it seems to be that, yes, now kind of these kind of services are in spotlight. And maybe that is just because of the trends, technology trends. Yeah, you can, on the one hand side, can do a lot more, but you have certain risks you need to cope with. And that's the reason why, to my mind, regulatory asks pharma to reconsider all the concepts, which originates from 80s, 70s, when there were no EDC systems, there were just paper-based trials. There were people who were comparing A with B, so to say, making source data verification. Now, there are systems around us, they are speaking with each other, but sometimes they are source of risk as well. And now the trials might go global. You start working with remote, more remote, in particular now in the COVID time. So it's all gets kind of distributed and digitalized. From this perspective, analytic like that plays a bigger role, and that's why, in fact, this attention.
Thank you. I already have like three concepts I want to explore as we continue talking. Craig, you want to talk about yourself? Because no one's heard of you. You're a relative unknown. So tell us more about yourself.
Darshan, I'm just a guy on LinkedIn.
Just a guy on LinkedIn.
That's it. You know what? This is like LinkedIn Live. Like, I feel like this is like three people I see on LinkedIn all the time. And now it's like LinkedIn talking to us. It's pretty cool. It's great to connect with all of you. So just for folks that I may not know that are viewing, My name is Craig Lipset. I was previously the head of clinical innovation at Pfizer, and right now I have an independent advisory practice. I work with pharma and biotech companies on their enterprise strategies for innovation in their development organizations, as well as with technology companies, whether pre-revenue or growth, or established health tech companies that want to diversify themselves into life sciences and clinical research. And then finally, I work with investors that are looking for help with deal flow and diligence in this category. I'm on the faculty at the University of Rochester in the Center for Health and Technology, as well as at Rutgers University in their Department of Health Informatics, where I'm an assistant professor lecturing and actually leading a course on clinical trial innovation. And I'm looking forward to this conversation, wherever it may go. All things 2020. We can talk about clinical trials running in COVID and where this is going. We can talk about murder hornets. We can talk about
I hate to break this to you, Craig. We're already past 2020. We're talking 2021 right now.
Sounds good to me, sir.
That's how breakthrough we are. You're on the latest podcast. Things move from here. So let me ask you a question, though. You are talking about, I think, at least for me, the first time I heard the name Craig Lipset was in the context of the centralized monitoring and Pfizer and the breakthrough work you were sort of doing at Pfizer. Obviously, that has changed and you've sort of grown into all these other pieces. My question for you was, there were people like Artem out there who were working through decentralized trials and risk-based monitoring. Do you feel like the work you did at Pfizer legitimized that and made it? And what I mean by I'm not trying to say that it's about you or anything like that. It's always a team. But the question is, do you feel like what you brought to the table made the industry go, okay, if Pfizer can do this, if they can do it right, and there were lessons learned, the rest of us can provide offerings that make sense? And I don't know if you can respond to that at all. I'm not sure if it's a statement or a question, but feel free.
So first off, I'm going to just separate out a couple of categories, because I worked on decentralized trials at Pfizer about 12 years ago. But when we were doing those first decentralized trials, we still had monitoring happening on site at a central site. And so we weren't necessarily taking advantage of some of the approaches that Artem has been pioneering and now so many others are embracing. They're kind of operating in two parallel spheres. And so today, I think we're starting to find people that are rapidly embracing on both sides this year, right? They're rapidly looking at transformation and how they do their monitoring, taking more data-driven approaches, using more remote and central monitoring, and they're looking at the transformation in location for where their studies can take place and how can we enable patients and others to participate without being able to get to the clinic. But now people are starting to appreciate the convergence of the two, I think, and starting to realize, some of these questions about how does monitoring look different when our studies are taking place outside of the clinic and we have all these new data streams that maybe we weren't anticipating in 2019. To your question, when we did that first remote trial, we were very deliberately, and there was a great commitment from our whole team at Pfizer on this, we were very deliberately, very transparent and communicative about what we were doing, which was a little unusual for Pfizer and many other pharma at that time. We talked very openly about the plan for the study and what worked and what didn't, and with the hopes that we could put the ball on the field. We didn't get to the end zone, but we could move the ball down the field, place it there, and do with transparency whatever we could to help others then pick up the ball and move it further. There's this 17-year history of decentralized trials image I've shared on LinkedIn and Twitter. And what's cool is you see this period of time where we had that Pfizer remote trial, and then you see the last 6 years, this burst of other pharma companies running experiments, this burst of venture investment, over $200 million invested during that period of time in ventures in that space. CROs, mainstream CROs, taking initiatives and building capacity there. So I do like to think that because we were very transparent about what we were doing, and I think made a fair amount of noise around it, it's amazing to see that others were able to launch related initiatives in their organizations and really move the ball so much further to 2020, where it actually became a vital part of our story about continuity.
So thank you. And Mo, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be in a virtual room with everyone live. Craig, awesome to see you again. Same with Artem. I'm really glad that we're reconnected. My name is Alsumidaie. To those of you who don't know me, I am the head of research and founder of CliniBiz, which is an integrated research organization that uses automation and technology to make clinical trials more efficient and affordable. We have currently 6 study sites under our group that we work with a variety of different indications, ranging mostly neurology and psychiatry through hepatology and cardiology. And I'm also chief data scientist of Annex Clinical, and Annex Clinical uses computer data science to advance research and generate outcomes and visualizations for a variety of different enterprises in healthcare and in clinical trials. Personally, I've been in this industry for 15 years. I've worked in big pharma for much of my previous career, and have been doing this for quite a bit with CliniBiz and Annex. And I also sit on the editorial advisory board of Applied Clinical Trials. You may have read some of my articles. And my hope is to advance clinical trials, to bring some thoughts for clinical operations personnel to think about how they could do things differently. So in a nutshell, that's who I am.
So first of all, we should mention, because this happened before the conversation even started, before we started recording, that Mo was the smartest one of us all. He went to San Diego.
Oh, no.
He went to San Diego. He's got 70-degree weather out there right now. And while the rest of us, well, I don't know where Artem and Craig are, but me personally, I'm struggling with my weather right now. So that's number one.
Darshan,
I'm sorry, what was the question again, Craig?
yeah, where in the world are you?
Oh, you're breaking in and out, but I'm in Philly.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not far.
I'm in Philadelphia.
New Jersey, so I'm suffering from the same weather that you are. Thanks, Mo.
I know you are.
Sorry to make you jealous. I don't mean to make you jealous.
Artem, where are you?
I'm in Germany currently, so the weather is very much actually could be better. Let's put this way. I'm looking at sunny weather out of Mo's window there, and of course it's already dark here. So anyway,
so the Germans would downplay the weather. But good for you. So I did want to ask you one quick question, Mo, only just to sort of introduce the concept. But you work for an IRO, and I've done a few recent conversations. I literally got off the phone with a client of mine who is an IRO. For those people who don't know, number one, what is an IRO? And number two, why aren't we calling it SMOs again?
So there are differences.
Yeah.
So an integrated research organization, we partner with sites that are research naive. Most of our sites are in fact research naive, except for West Virginia University, where we work with one of the medical cardiologists there. But essentially, as an IRO, we become integrated and become a part of the site. So we, unlike an SMO, which is a separate entity, we actually oversee site activities and are involved in clinical research. So we have direct exposure to the day-to-day things that are happening in clinical trials. And on top of that, we also provide advisory advice to sponsors that are smaller when they are trying to launch their studies. For example, like one of our sponsors was having issues with recruitment and enrollment. We actually sat together with the sponsor, and we have weekly meetings with the sponsor to sit with them to discuss the challenges and work them through. And so we kind of act as if we're the pilot sites to try new things with sponsors, and then the other sites follow suit. Sometimes we feel special because we're the only ones that are doing this with the companies that we serve. But at the same time, it generates successful results. It pushes innovation. It gets people to think very differently. And also it exposes us to a lot of the on-the-ground things that are happening with clinical trials, especially during the COVID pandemic, where we've seen so many interesting approaches and issues that have arisen from different implementation strategies. So that's really the main difference. An SMO is kind of a separate entity. They match studies to physicians, and then They offer a few services here and there. We're actually integrated. We talk with the sites. We're part of the team.
Okay. So let's start with the basic thing. The basic commonality I saw between the three of you, outside the fact that someone apparently gave out a memo that we're supposed to wear sweaters with zippers up front, and I didn't get that memo. But ignoring that commonality, I noticed all three of you are really big on data. And I mean, all of you are sort of talking about the value of data. I see Artem talking about the fact that he created a data quality bureau. How, obviously, data has been the core of what we have always looked at in the clinical trials industry. But how has that changed in the last several years? I'm not keeping it focused on a pure centralized trials discussion. I'm just saying, how has the value and the focus on data changed? And how is that playing out in 2021 and later? So let's start with, I'm going to keep doing Artem, Craig, and Mo, just because that's how you show up on my screen. So Artem.
So in fact, what we see currently is actually a new trend where several years ago, before there were clouds which accumulate data. Some big companies like Viva, Medidata, Clinical Inc. and others who accumulate. Mm-hmm. On the other hand side, there are many smaller biotech companies who have just one study. The thing is that they don't have access to the knowledge of the information. So they are isolated. However, the market, the industry asks us to go into more personalized medicine and more personalized smaller cohorts, even thinking about one pill for one person one day. How to make it happen? So the movements which I feel there is a right one is to create a cloud of information which analyzes the data. Some cloud which connects to various recording systems, to various EDC providers, and have the ability to utilize the intelligence from not one study, but from 500 of studies. Mm-hmm. And then give it this intelligence to every new startup worldwide who designs a study, and say, for example, you may create a pharma company in the garage now, for just a small medication, and you will receive ability to recognize risks, performance issues, and data quality issues right away. So this is to my mind, what is going on right away, right now, where there is ability for more and more for younger generation to move into the pharma industry and generate and create a kind of innovative, I don't know, COVID-19 vaccine. And it should be not always Pfizer, who does it,
I'm going to challenge you on that, Artem. Two different challenges to it. My first challenge is the fact that, as a concept, it sounds great. You're talking about the concept of data freedom. And you're talking about the fact that data, once it comes out, shouldn't belong to one company, it should belong to the world. That sounds great in some senses. Here's the issue with it. Whose data is it?
No, in fact, I'm not speaking that the data should be kind of making accessible to everybody. I'm speaking that, for example, the metadata, meta information, risk information, performance information could be accessible to everybody. And we do it right now. For example, we all have an antivirus installed in our computer. What is that? It's a shared intelligence. So we do it already every day. We use, for example, navigational system. It communicates with all other cars around. It's a shared intelligence. So Bloomberg is the same doing in finance industry. So it analyzes the risks and gives you a global picture about certain areas to invest or not to invest. So again, this is already happening in many, many aspects. And that's what I'm talking about. You would receive not the data itself, but the intelligence out of it. So for example, trained neural networks, which can predict how your study will go. And you may play with this and they say, okay, what if I do amendment? What if I do another site? What if I do da-da-da-da-da? And this what if analysis can bring you the real scenario, how the study might go. And this gives you ability, instead of investing 100 millions for a drug just to be very lean. And with, I don't know, maybe only 10 millions of investments, get a drug or vaccine ready.
Right.
That opens the potential of having smaller companies entering the market and get a more personalized medicine and get a more competition around pharma. So to my mind, that's where we are currently. What is happening now or begins to happen.
Craig? Thank you, Artem.
You're welcome.
So what's the deal with data in clinical trials, huh?
How's Seinfeld interview?
What's the deal? So there's so many different, aspects to that. And certainly, the places that I think a lot of CROs and many pharma companies are bulking up with data scientists has been around their aspiration to use more diverse data in study design and planning. And so within most development organizations, not necessarily across the entire life sciences company, the place that seems to be bulking up around data science right now is around study optimization, feasibility, and site selection, with the aspiration that there's a lot of different data that people in that role have been using for many years. How can they use it better? And how can they start to introduce decision support that can make that space a little more thoughtful? I think that in the past, while the people in that category used a lot of data, sometimes that data hits their inbox too early. There aren't necessarily thoughtful machines in place that are making recommendations. And I'm not suggesting Flippy in your Microsoft Word popping up and telling you, so it looks like you're trying to write inclusion criteria. But nevertheless, how can people have more access and become almost citizen data scientists today by democratizing some of the insights and information there? Certainly, the acquisition of data in trials is consuming more and more types of diverse data, whether sensors and wearables, aspirations to bring in real world data into clinical trials, perhaps by tokenization with patient permission, maybe even bringing in social and other information also into trials with the hope that there's other learnings that we can capture. And that's certainly driving a renaissance around the analytics needs that people have, this appreciation that when it comes to study data analysis, have we necessarily evolved our workforce to be ready for that diversity of data? I think that some of the more interesting areas that people are exploring are when they're looking at, interesting new sources of data coupled with AI to do things like digital twins and synthetic control arms. But I think two of the big shifts I would get excited about, since as you said, we're talking 21 and beyond, 2020 is old news. I would say the two that I'm really looking forward towards, the first is the appreciation that the protocol itself is data, and that our legacy mindset that we are just writing a protocol in Microsoft Word to write down what we should be doing and to monitor and to manage, and instead the appreciation that that protocol itself, if written in a standardized way, can actually be data that drives automation downstream. And I think Transcelerate did a good job of queuing that up with a common protocol template, but now we're seeing other entrepreneurs and other technologists rising up to really bring that to life and to let us drive the automation that can improve quality and accelerate so many downstream processes. I think the second area that I'm particularly excited about is the convergence of our hunger for data with the increased ability for patients and people to access and share their own personal health data. And as we aspire for eSource and all these other ways we can capture data, the beauty to this within a clinical trial with a consented individual who's giving their permission is to put them at the center of that process and let them be the mediators of this incredible universe of diverse data that we'll be able to bring in. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I'm a patient who's in a clinical trial that's running down the block at New York University Medical Center, yeah, you could try and tap the NYU EMR, their electronic medical record, to learn about me through my investigator. But patients don't just go to one doctor, and their records don't just exist at one medical center. And so for you to get the full picture of the real world data about me, your best source to get it is through me. And as those types of tools continue to emerge, whether using HIPAA right of access, using tokenization, or a range of different approaches, I think we're going to start to see this convergence come back together of patient centricity and diversity of data.
I love so many of the things you've talked about. So I want to come back to a few of them, but the one that just popped out to me, and I admit I'm slightly biased being a lawyer, but the one that really popped out to me was the idea of tokenization and patient control, because I'm really tied into the idea of patient centricity. What I heard you talk about, however, was how data can improve the world, which is great. My question is, from a privacy standpoint, do we really, at this point, enable patients to say no? And GDPR obviously goes in that direction, and CCPA goes in that direction, and most current state, CIPRA, California allows for CIPRA, where you actually have monetization of data. And obviously it's so brand new that nothing's come out about it. But Craig, do you have any thoughts about that yet? Or, because I can see you ready to chomp at the bit there, so go ahead.
First off, Darshan, you should open every section with a disclaimer that you're a lawyer, so that we can get that out of the way right at the outset. But for those of you that know me, know that I am very troubled about the separation that's taking place around precision medicine and hunger for diverse data, and patient inclusion, patient centricity, and transparency. And when you look at most life sciences companies today, and you see the words that they're putting out there, they all want to show that they're big on data, and they all want to show that they're big on patient engagement and patient inclusion. And yet, when we look at how organizations are using real world data today, it certainly looks like it's going the opposite direction. To me, this starts to look like the Henrietta Lacks 2.0 that we're entering in, right? Where, Henrietta Lacks, if most of your audience probably knows the story, her African-American woman, she was born 100 years ago, so it's a little bit older of a story, but she just had her 100th birthday celebration. Okay. But she was treated at Johns Hopkins, and as a part of her care, some of her tumor cells were taken just as a part of her care. But what they realized is Henrietta Lacks' tumor cells had a certain immortality to them. They continued to grow and replicate. Henrietta passed away, but Hopkins continued to grow and replicate those cells. And an entire industry was born that did amazing things, right? When you look at vaccines research, when you look at HIV and AIDS, when you look at so many different disease areas, so much of the research was done using HeLa cells because they proved to be remarkable. But what was not remarkable was the fact that Henrietta Lacks' family had no idea that her cells were being used in this way, that literally tons of HeLa cells have been grown and shared with researchers around the world, many folks profiting, not necessarily Hopkins, in the process, and her family none the wiser, not engaged, not included. That separation of the source from all of the good that's happening, but also a lot of the financial transactions that are happening, is one of the blights on research from that Henrietta Lacks time. And my fear is we're setting up for another one of these, because everyone on this call, all of your personal health data is being bought and sold right now. Everyone who's watching your data is, and you don't necessarily know it. And so the thing that's exciting to me are the models that are starting to emerge where organizations can answer important research questions, but do it in a way that's inclusive and engaging and permissioned with patients. When I'm talking about that concept of trial tokenization, what we're talking about here is, first off, the reality that your diverse real-world data that's in different silos being sold, there are platforms that can help researchers to connect those data, to help them to say, well, you're de-identified, but this data point, which might be mine in this data set, is the same person as this data point in another set, and let them make that connection. They're using keys to do that. It's not illegal, it's not necessarily wrong. But what's great with the trial tokenization rise that we're seeing is these are with patients who are prospectively consenting, they're participating in research studies, and they can give their permission for that same ability to connect from different otherwise de-identified data sets and be able to link that back to me. And I think that's going to be a great opportunity for researchers, because we can do it in an inclusive way, we could do it in a permission.
Beautifully said. Mo, your turn with data and how it's changed.
This is sparking so many interesting ideas. And I love what you're saying, Craig, about permissioned approaches, and I think with the digitization of data, I think that we will be able to have a lot more control over permissions because of the electronic aspect and the ways that electronics essentially work. You can easily provide that permission to patients and clearly dictate what their data can be used for. What we're seeing right now is a deluge of technology enterprises that are starting to do decentralized clinical trials. And what's so interesting about this is that what we've found is that sponsors have struggled to try and go into decentralized clinical trials. I can give you examples of some of the things we've seen at CliniBiz versus the Annex Clinical side, which is fully computer data science. And what I can tell you is that some sponsors, like right now, that did not employ a data approach towards clinical trials are seeing significant issues and problems. For example, especially the smaller pharma companies that did not pilot studies using electronic means and forms we're starting to see many issues. For example, with one of our sites, we're seeing a lot of compliance related issues because of the way that the remote consent was implemented. They were using paper-based consenting methodologies rather than electronic consenting to consent the patients. And of course, that's setting up the sites for failure because of poor quality by design. So of course, they were missing documents everywhere. But the smart companies are the ones that used electronic consenting and electronic forms of clinical operations in order to achieve this. And going all towards decentralized, we're seeing a huge influx of demand that is now coming from technology enterprises that want to better understand the data that's coming out of the clinical trials and through decentralized trials. I can give you an example of some of the things we did in the past few years. And and there's actually a paper in the International Journal of Clinical Trials that demonstrates this, where you can start taking a look at metadata. For example, patient behavioral data and their impact on different parts of clinical trials. For example, we found that educational videos in an app-based decentralized clinical trial, basically patients were taking blood pressure cuff measurements, and they were supposed to take blood pressure cuff measurements at a certain time of day. And what we found is that the patients were surveyed afterwards about the videos, whether they found the educational videos to be helpful. And we were able to do a statistical analysis evaluating the impact of whether the patients understood the videos or whether they found the videos to be helpful on compliance levels. And sure enough, there was a positive statistical correlation or association between patients finding the videos to be very helpful and high compliance levels. So in other words, if patients found the videos to be helpful, they tended to have higher compliance levels. So think about the opportunities that this can expand with behavioral analytics with regards to clinical operations. And think about being able to predict outcomes when you start getting into big data collection. So for example, you can start using artificial intelligence to predict when patients are going to drop out of a trial, or predict when a patient's going to be non-compliant, or even, and not only that, but you can also think about providing action to sites to prevent these things from happening. So for example, if a patient is predicted to drop out, you can instruct the site to say, hey, you might want to engage the patient in order to prevent this dropout or improve the compliance rate before that happens. And really, I think the big benefits of data is that you're letting the system do the work and taking the work away from human beings after the fact, which usually results in a lot more work for people to do. So by relying on the systems to do that work and humans to essentially perform optimized actions, you will have a huge difference with very little effort. So I think that's where the real value of data is coming from. It's almost as if, it's like the Google age, but in clinical trials and decentralized clinical trials, where you have data that is available and can be used to benefit patients, to benefit the research enterprise, by essentially making trials more efficient and also less costly because of those issues that happen after the fact. I think other areas where we're really going to see benefits and significant advances in data are going to be involved in using natural language and open language essentially to take a look at quality outcomes. So for example, there's a treasure trove right now of data inside of pharma companies' CTMS systems or clinical trial management systems that is full text. Like, for example, monitoring reports, quality reports, audit reports, that you can essentially use algorithms to go in and take a look from an analytical standpoint to evaluate whether there's a real issue that's happening from an analytical standpoint at a study site based on what is being said in those reports. And you can, from a managerial standpoint, evaluate the quality or the health of your trial by simply looking at how the data is playing in those monitoring reports from a bigger picture standpoint. So I think there are lots of opportunities that are arising now with the digitization of clinical trials. And of course, what this means is higher quality data, a better trusted enterprise, and more efficient trials, which means that smaller companies that were not previously able to enter the market because of the cost of clinical trials can suddenly come in and become a part of the process because of the efficiency that's generated. I think that in the future, clinical trials is not going to be the big expensive project or really process that it is today. I think that eventually they're going to become so efficient that we're going to see all kinds of innovations and new medical products that are going to come into the market from companies that were previously unable to penetrate the market because of the restrictive cost of research. So I think that this is a great advancement for patients, it's a great advancement for the industry, and it's a great advancement for all of the players that are advancing the technology in this industry.
Mo, I have so many follow-up questions for you, but apparently based on the last recommendation by Mr. Lipset, I feel like I need to first disclaim myself and give you guys a full perspective, which may not have been clear. Just to be clear, I am an attorney, but I also have a doctorate in pharmacy, so I have 20 years of experience as a pharmacist, doing clinical research and the like. I've worked as a GC, as a general counsel, chief compliance officer, and I've done some work around being a VP of regulatory strategy for a global consulting company. And I'm on various advisory boards and stuff, but right now I'm the chair of the life sciences section for the American Bar Association. So pretty involved in this type of work. The reason I sort of give that perspective is my next question. And this is sort of, I'm going to throw it out there and I'm going to let it, because I feel like Mo touched it. And I know Craig's gonna jump on it as soon as I start mentioning it. So from here on out, for whatever time we have left, this is a bit of a free for all. So you mentioned a few minutes ago, Mo, this idea of how the cost of clinical trials will go down. That to me raises two different issues, or at least, well, several different issues. But one of them is just the concept of, I don't know if you guys have ever dealt with the concept of biohacking. I've had clients who do biohacking. So this would be an offshoot of that, which would really result in potential biodata hacking and what that could look like. But if you take that next step, what is the implication? How does that feed into something like, say, telehealth? But really what I was thinking of was what Craig talked about, which is synthetic arms. And this idea of you being able to drop the cost of studies using digital twins and synthetic arms. And I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, Artem, you might know, Mo, you might know, but I believe the FDA's Janus system was supposed to get into that. And I don't know what the current standard on it is. I thought that they, in the ARA, I think ARA in 2009 had funding for it. And I think FDA had about 495 million. I don't know why I'm pulling out such a specific number. It was probably 500 million or so. But I I think that was about the kind of funding they had to start getting it into place. I don't know how live or active it is the second. But Mo, I'm going to give you first shot because this is your first jump up. But after that, everyone just feel free to jump in. What is your take on synthetic arms, and is that going to be part of how costs drop?
That's a great question. And in conducting a lot of interviews in the industry, I've seen this happening in real time. So for example, there's this company called Stemonics that essentially creates mini brains in a slide, essentially. And what's really cool about this approach is that if I understand what they do correctly, what you can do essentially is evaluate efficacy endpoints way earlier. Like, when you're talking about preclinical, where you can evaluate the impact of a medical product in essentially a slide. And you can see how those changes are happening. I think that when you're looking at that, you're really reducing the cost of failures later on by being able to do it all in the slide. So I think there's significant advances in that area. In terms of the way data works, I can see that there's a lot of areas where that's already happening in early phase, where you can use data to essentially optimize the molecule before putting it into clinical trials. I think that we're seeing a lot of companies doing that and have been doing that for a while. But I really think that the biggest advances are going to be those clinical trials in a test tube, as we're calling them, where we're using advances like CRISPR and stem cells to essentially grow human body parts to evaluate the impact of medical products in preclinical phases.
Awesome. Craig, you've been chomping for a while, so please.
It shows, doesn't it? Like the control arms in clinical trials are resource intensive and they're largely undesirable by patients, and so present as an inhibitor for participation while consuming 50% of the attention and resource from any study team. And so that's given rise to this aspiration that we can reduce the number of patients needed in a control arm and potentially supplement that with other types of synthetic options, or potentially eliminate a control arm. So how are people doing that today? It sort of started in the earlier days with people using historical control arm data. And you had initiatives at places like Transcelerate and initiatives that companies like Medidata had been driving around seeing, can we reuse the control arms from historical studies? Now that's a good thing because the data is clean, but it's a bad thing because it's not contemporary. Standards of care change over time. How far in the past can you really use my control arm data? And so enter real world evidence and real world data, and people saying, well, let's use EMRs for that. And that is kind of the standard for where we are right now. You'll see some companies, particularly in oncology, that will put out RFPs that almost look like they're recruiting patients into an arm of a study, but they're really sending those eligibility criteria out to large data aggregators saying, how many patients that meet these criteria can you send me to populate my control arm for my study? Now, that's good in that it's contemporary. It's challenged in that it's poorly structured, but I think it's really challenged because you're taking my data and you're putting me in the control arm of your trial, and I don't even know that's happening. Yeah. And so it goes back to that conversation earlier. I question the sustainability of that approach. Now, I think others like Datavant and Citizen are taking approaches that do this in a more inclusive and permissioned way. Can we go with a patient like Citizen might, where their model is we use HIPAA right of access to help patients get their real world data to share it? And then you have, I think, some of the more cutting edge approaches, this idea of a digital twin, which dates back to the aerospace industry and the automotive industry. Can you generate through sensors and other data sources enough information from an engine that may be on a plane in the field somewhere, and I can basically replicate it in front of me and create a twin of that for diagnostic purposes and maintenance purposes? And now with all the data you can get about me, can you basically do the same and create a digital instance of me with all of this diverse data that's available? And what's interesting is, there's some companies like Unlearn and others that are taking this approach saying, can I basically take Craig, and if he is enrolled in the active arm of a trial, can I create a digital twin of Craig and put him in the control arm? And my digital twin can actually be my own control in the same study, which is a really fascinating approach. I think the last one that I'll throw out here is this rise of the master protocols and this idea of being able to run umbrella and bucket studies and look at multiple different drugs testing in one patient population under one protocol model. And what we see there is sort of similar in that we can reuse certain control data to compare against multiple molecules. And again, it sort of gives us some of that same powerful ability to not spend 50% of our attention for every study on enrolling patients that we may be able to get that equivalent data from elsewhere. I think this is an exciting time. I think the regulators have been very receptive, but they want to see more. And so it's what I love about this, Darshan, this is my call for all the sponsors that are out there listening. You can do this right now and experiment in this place in a non-disruptive, low-risk way. Run this as an experiment, as a third arm in an existing trial. Enroll your study just as you always would. No risk to you. Have your regular active patients and your control patients, and then identify an option that, like we were just talking about, and do it as an experimental third arm so you can learn and start to understand and be able to help share that and inform the regulators about how could a synthetic arm have operated in this study, and could we have generated comparably and generated comparable conclusions.
So, Craig, I'm going to challenge that because I have a question for you that goes along with it. If you create a synthetic arm, whether it's a third arm or a second arm, my question is, that means that I, as a patient, know that I'm getting the active product. If I know I'm getting the active product, it defeats the whole point of a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled study. So how would that work? How do you maintain the neutrality and avoid the bias in a scenario where you have a synthetic control arm?
I think in the near term, the way that happens is by us using these innovative data sources to reduce the size of the control arm.
Okay.
So some percentage of patients will still be randomized, but not one-to-one.
Right.
Your chances will be disproportionately greater of getting the active.
Right.
More of the patients in our study will be on the active arm, but you still don't know. You're still being randomized. Just your probability isn't 50-50.
But so is there a possibility of a future where there is no control arm, or that's just not possible because of the risk of bias?
I think the risk of bias is going to be an interesting one. And personally, I think the way we'll find pathways towards mitigating some of that risk of bias is by revolutionizing and modernizing a lot of the measurements and endpoints for our studies, measurements that can be far more objective, physiologically based, and ones that really aren't relying on the interpretation of a patient or a physician, but can simply rely on the data that we're able to capture today that we were never able to capture before. I also, though, love the direction Mo was painting here, because what I've described is taking care of 50% of the burden of a trial, the control arm. But where Mo is pointing is, well, what can we do about the other 50%? Because while a CRO or a site may not like to hear it, a patient certainly would like to hear that we don't need anyone to be enrolled in a prospective clinical trial, that we can model this, that we can generate enough evidence using other types of synthetic approaches. Will that entirely replace a clinical trial in the future? I don't know, but it's certainly a potential future out there that I think could be really exciting.
Awesome. Guys, this conversation has gone by really, really quickly. Everyone gets a minute. Any last words, Artem?
I believe we were speaking today about different concepts, digitalization, about the synthetic arms, about improving the quality for individual sites, what Mo mentioned, and for studies overall, what Craig mentioned. I think the next step is to make us literate in data science. So having ability to understand, for example, what is data rights, from the legal standpoint. For example, if I'm able to delete my personalized information, if I'm able to deactivate the access for companies I don't wish to have this access, if I'm able to, for example, monetize my data, so to say, for the future. So this will happen more and more now in the patients, in clinical research overall. But also in pharma companies, where many pharma employees are previously were somebody like study nurses, or they have no clue what data science is, and how to use it, how to apply it. And what we are talking about here today is actually this what if analysis, the synthetic arms. This is something, it's like a mystery there. We need to become literate. We need all together to have ability to provide a data science in the box somehow, so expertise in the box, so that everybody can start using it. Many years ago, Apple has done it with personalized computers. You remember that? So they have enabled mainframes for everybody, and this needs to happen in data science as well. So data science currently is accessible to big organizations like Google, Apple, and a couple of more. But now we might think how to enable it, how to make it possible to everybody. So how everybody can benefit from this for their personal life, altogether for their personal health, and for some monetary gains out of it. So that's my minute.
Awesome, thank you. Craig.
Darshan, we operate in a risk-averse industry. There's no surprise to that. We're doing important work here that involves an investigational medicine being introduced into a human. Now, Darshan, you're a lawyer, but there are many in our industry who think they're lawyers and act like lawyers in terms of that risk aversion. I would argue that if there's one takeaway from 2020, it's that we've reached a tipping point where the risk of inaction has now exceeded the risk of action. We've seen that this year, and why people have adopted decentralized trials, why people have adopted innovative strategies for monitoring for their studies. These things were all available, as you heard today, but the risk of inaction exceeded the risk of action. And I think that mindset is going to stay with us for a while. That doesn't mean being reckless. It means taking thoughtful risk and trying the new. And for many organizations going forward, these different areas that we've been talking about today are accessible to start to experiment and start to introduce in our organizations. No action is no longer your safety move.
Love it. Mo?
And in echoing what Craig and Artem are saying, I think that there's a lot of opportunities here. As you introduce digitization into clinical trials, you become a data company. And as a computer data scientist, I see that there's a lot of opportunities to benefit patients. But as we are seeing right now with technology companies such as Google, Microsoft, and a lot of the social media companies like Facebook, they're now getting in trouble because of their practices in using data that might be considered malicious or unethical. And I think that as pharmaceutical companies and the biopharmaceutical industry becomes a data approach and also become data companies, we need to think very carefully about how we're putting the patient at the forefront, because that's why we're all in this business, to bring therapies to make patients' quality of lives easier and to prolong lives and the quality of life better. So I think that as we start introducing data in here, we have to be very careful about how we consider the patient in the middle of this equation and what this means for the patient. And I think that now regulators are starting to become extremely stringent on how data practices are happening. I think that it's not going to be much longer before regulators also start looking at the biopharmaceutical industry and really implementing regulation that are specific to data practices. So not only are we going to be familiar with GCPs, ICHs, the CFR, we're also going to be having, another acronym of some sort that deals with data,
Right.
So really it's extremely important to make that consideration as you start, if you're a sponsor, especially big pharma, as you start to go into data, to really consider the patient.
Little bit of a last word from me. I came into this conversation hoping to talk about decentralized studies, and I think we touched on it, but it really became an amazing conversation about data. So I want to thank all three of you for coming on, having a really broad conversation that, quite bluntly, we had an agenda, but we kind of just let the conversation flow. This was a lot of fun. I'd love to do it again. I'd love to invite all of you back again and have another conversation, theoretically, about centralized monitoring and decentralized trials and all that good stuff. Let's see where that goes too.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.